Natalie had spent years pretending her hands belonged to a nurse and nobody else. At bed 4, under the hard white light of Trauma 4B, that lie got thin in a hurry. The Marine on the mattress was 23 at most, broad in the shoulders, skin turning, that bad grey blue that came right before people slid somewhere she couldn't drag them back from. Foam shone at one corner of his mouth. The monitor above him screamed in short red bursts, the SPO2 number dropping through the 70s, like it had someplace to be. A pulse ox beeped too fast. Air hissed somewhere in the room. Plastic rustled. The whole bay had that ugly midnight soundtrack hospitals made when things were about to go sideways for real. A resident stood at the bedside with a Scalpel packet half open in one shaking hand, eyes bouncing from the chest tube tray to the kid's face to the blood blooming under old bandaging near the upper torso. He kept looking for permission from a room that had already run out of time. Natalie didn't waste a second on him. Her gaze took the chest rise, the tracheal pull, the bad pressure building under the rib cage. Tension, pneumo. Not maybe. Not probably. Her fingers were already at the trauma cart, tearing open a 14-gauge needle while the Marine made a wet, starving sound that tightened every muscle in the room except hers. She moved in close enough to smell old sweat under hospital soap and the copper bite of fresh blood. The resident started saying something about waiting, about protocol, about a doctor needing to call it. Natalie tuned him out. Her whole world narrowed to skin, bone, angle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her left sleeve had ridden up while she reached, showing the rough white scar on her forearm for half a second before the cuff dropped again. Nobody in the room seemed to notice, but the man in bed 2 across the aisle did. Tex Graves lay propped against his pillow with that titanium frame spearing through his ruined thigh. One hand clamped hard around the bar like he could throttle the pain if he squeezed long enough. His stare had gone still. Natalie felt it and ignored it. She planted the heel of one hand on the Marine's upper chest, found the mark, and drove the needle in with one fast, ugly, practiced motion. There it was. A vicious hiss burst through the catheter, a tight snake of pressure venting free. The sound cut through the alarms, through the residents cursing, through everything. The Marine's chest shuddered. Then it eased. Not fixed. Just no longer dying that exact second. Colour came back slow, like somebody turning a dimmer instead of flipping a switch. The blue at the patient's lips thinned first. Then his jaw unclenched. Air moved. Shallow, shaky, but real. The monitor kept barking, though less like a funeral and more like an argument. Natalie watched 3 breaths, maybe 4, long enough to know the collapse had backed off. Behind her, the resident finally found his voice now that the worst of it was over. He came in hot, embarrassed and loud, the way weak men usually did when a room had watched them fail. What the hell was that? You don't do that without an order. You don't touch my patient without an order. He was close enough, she could smell coffee gone sour on his breath. He sounded less outraged than stripped bare. Natalie peeled off one glove, then the other, turning them inside out with blood and sweat trapped in the fingers, and dropped them into the red bin without looking at him. Her shoulders ached. Her eyes felt full of sand. Then put it in the report that you did it, she said. Flat. Bored. Like she was reminding somebody to sign a form. She hooked a thumb toward the clock on the wall. My shift's over. That made him angrier than if she'd yelled back. He launched into another round of policy. Chain of command. And future complaints he swore would stick. She let the words hit and slide off. What stayed with her wasn't his voice. It was the room settling after the save. The Marine's breathing. rough but moving, the antiseptic sting in the air, the monitor's red pulse washing over polished linoleum, Tex still watching from across the aisle, fingers white around the metal strut in his leg. He didn't smirk, didn't crack wise. He just looked at her forearm, then her face, then at the empty sheath of the 14 gauge in the trash, like he was fitting pieces together and not liking the picture. Natalie turned away before he could say a word. She wanted quiet. A locker room bench. 5 minutes with nobody asking for miracles. Instead, she stepped into the hallway, and the ward gave her that midnight hospital hush that was never really silence. Distant wheels. A cough behind a curtain. HVAC air moving through old vents. At the far end, near the shadowed turn by the service elevators, 2 men in puffy IT jackets came through the double doors without a sound. Too smooth for tech support, too square in the shoulders. One of them carried a hard case low against his leg. The other walked as if he already knew every exit on the floor. Natalie felt the old counting reflex click on behind her eyes. Distance to the stairwell. Distance to the medroom. Distance to cover. One of the men glanced up. Then the lights above 4B flickered once. The lights flickered once. Twice. Then the whole floor dropped dead. One clean cut. Monitors went black for half a heartbeat before backup current hit somewhere deeper in the building, and then the emergency strips came alive in a wet red wash that turned the corridor butcher paper red. Natalie stopped moving. Ozone stung the back of her throat. The 2 men down the hall didn't flinch. That told her more than a badge ever could. They had expected the blackout. Around her, Trauma 4B made the small animal sounds of confusion, a nurse swearing under her breath, a patient waking scared, wheels knocking against a wall in the dark. Natalie pulled her phone from her pocket out of pure habit. No bars, no searching signal, just a dead, cheerful little message. No service. Not a tower issue. Too clean. Too total. And with it came something else. The tiny digital hum of the floor seemed to collapse. No vibration chirps. No message pings. No searching buzz from 100 phones quietly trying to find a signal. Somebody had lit up an IMS eye catcher inside the building and smothered the floor in a fake sky. She slid the phone back into her scrub top and felt her pulse settle instead of spike. Cellular was gone. Whatever this was, it had come with planning, hardware, and a clock already running. She didn't know the number on that clock yet. She knew it existed. Glass broke in the VIP corridor with a sharp, expensive sound. Then came the colder noise. Not movie gunfire. Not loud. Just the dry, mechanical clack of a suppressed bolt cycling, followed a beat later by brass hitting linoleum. One casing, then another. Sharp little metallic ticks. Clean. Spaced. Pitiless. They sounded worse than shots. Natalie saw the 2 security details at the end of the hall, only as shapes at first. One folding awkwardly into the wall, the other dropping straight down, as if a hinge had vanished inside his knees. She smelled fresh powder under the ozone. The men in the IT jackets had shed the disguise without wasting motion. Black armor under the nylon. Dark helmets. 4-lens night vision folded low like insect eyes. MP7 with long cans on the front. Muzzles tracking steady. No adrenaline in them. No shouting. No barking. Just a whispered hand signal and a turn of shoulders. They moved in a tight funnel, pieing corners, locking the escape routes before anyone on the ward understood that escape was the thing being taken away. Natalie backed toward a parked crash cart and kept her steps soft. Unarmed. tired. Right shoulder already, warning her with that deep, old ache it used to give before weather changes and bad choices. A patient down the hall started yelling for help. One of the black-armoured men passed the open doorway without even turning his head. That mattered. Natalie filed it fast. They were not here to stack civilian bodies for fun. They were bypassing rooms, ignoring soft targets, giving the beds a wide berth unless a door blocked their line of movement. Another operator knelt near the service junction and cracked open the hard case. Inside sat a squat piece of electronics with antennas folded flat. LED winking behind smoked plastic. The fake tower. The signal killer. The floor sealer. She could almost feel the geometry of it spreading through the ward, blanketing every phone, every lazy hope somebody still had about calling downstairs and fixing this with a code phrase. One of the men fed quiet words into his throat mic, too low to make out. Brevity, not panic. Ghosts talking to ghosts. Natalie looked past him and counted. 3 visible. Maybe more in the blind angles. Fatal funnel discipline at the hallway mouth. 1 gun covering long. 1 crossing. 1 working the hardware. Good team. Expensive team. Not smash and grab punks. She eased down behind the crash cart, metal drawers cool against her forearm, and checked the corridor reflections in the glass of a darkened room door. The red emergency light flattened everything, but it still gave her edges. Timing. Movement. Enough to stay alive for another minute. From inside bed 2, she heard the faint grind of titanium against a hospital frame. Tex. He hadn't called out. Smart man. A second later, an operator reached the fire door and cinched a magnetic brace across the push bar. Another did the same at the stairwell access. Physical lock. Digital lock. Layered isolation. Natalie hated professionals for their efficiency, because it always looked so calm while people died around it. A nurse she knew from nights, Carla. Pediatrics, float. Bad coffee breath. Loud laugh. Stumbled into the hall with a flashlight. One of the operators lifted a hand and flicked 2 fingers at her. Not threatening, just directing. Back inside. Seal the room. She froze, then obeyed. That told Natalie something else. Mission discipline. They wanted the ward contained, not butchered. Which meant their objective sat somewhere beyond flesh. Server room. Records. Pharmacy network. Cable closet. Somewhere data lived. Somewhere worth bringing an IMSI suitcase and suppressed subguns into a military hospital after midnight. The nearest refuge was the med room 50 feet away, past a yellow jet blast warning sign somebody had stolen from an air deck and hung as a joke years ago. Natalie had mocked it every shift for 6 months. Now it looked like a landmark, drawn by God. She waited for the point man to sweep left, counted the spacing, saw the rear guard glance toward the nurse's station. Then she moved, bent low, sliding from shadow to shadow until she felt the hard side of the crash cart kiss her hip again at a new angle. Closer. Better. Ahead of her. The team turned as one and began to scan straight toward the medroom door she had already picked for cover. Dust drifted down through the gap in the drop ceiling and turned red in the emergency lights. Natalie lay flat on her stomach above the medroom, cheek pressed to cold metal grid, one arm threaded between cables and dusty ductwork so her weight wouldn't punch straight through the tiles. Beneath her, boots moved slow and heavy across linoleum. Not rushed. Confident. Armor weight. Plate carrier rubbing on the doorframe. She tracked him by FOD first, then sound, the way she used to track rotor wash by gravel, Tiny white flecks shook loose every time he shifted. They spun in the light like ash. Her lungs wanted a deep breath. She gave them half of one and stopped there. The man below her had an MP7 slung tight across his chest and a knife riding high on his vest. He checked shelves, scanned corners, muzzle moving with his eyes. No wasted motion. No chatter. Just business. Natalie eased a vial from the pocket of her scrub top and felt the glass tap once against her knuckles. Such an alcholine. Clear as water. Meaner than a bullet if it got where it needed to go. She drew it into a syringe with hands that still looked steady in the dark. Her heart pounded high and hard against the cracked bone under her chest. Years of pretending did that. It taught the body how to lie when the rest of you was on fire. He came another step in, directly under the sag in the ceiling where she had been waiting. Natalie saw the pale crescent of his neck between helmet strap and collar. Not much skin. Enough. She slid the syringe between her teeth, planted one hand on the joist, and let herself drop. The ceiling tar gave with a soft, ugly crack and a burst of chalk dust. Then all the weight in the world happened at once. She hit his back hard, her forearms cinched across the top of his armor, her knees smashing into plates and straps and bone. He bucked on instinct. She found the side of his throat by feel and drove the needle in deep. Not elegant, just fast. The plunger bottomed under her thumb. The soldier made a strangled grunt and twisted with brutal force, one hand clawing for her wrist, the other trying to bring the gun around. Natalie felt his body understand before his mind did. His neck muscles went iron, then wrong. He slammed backward into the shelving to crush her there. Medicine bottles burst and rattled down around them. She lost her grip. A huge gloved hand caught a fistful of her scrub top and flung her sideways like she weighed nothing. She hit a steel cabinet ribs first. The crack that shot through her left side was wet and intimate and close to her ear, like somebody snapping a green branch inside her chest. For a second the room narrowed to a white pin. Air vanished. Not fear. Mechanics. Her fourth rib cracked violently, and her body knew it before her brain caught up. She folded over the pain and bit down hard enough to taste blood in her mouth. Across from her, the soldier staggered 2 steps and tried to raise the MP7. He was still awake. That was the ugly part. Eyes wide, furious, fully there. But the signal from brain to body had already started dying in the wire. The muzzle wobbled. His finger hit the trigger guard and slipped. His chest jerked once, then stopped moving the way a chest should. No dramatic collapse. Just silence settling around a man who could no longer pull air because the diaphragm had gone offline. He looked at her with a kind of animal disbelief, mouth opening to drag in a breath that never arrived. Natalie watched him sink to one knee, then the other. Watched the fight stay trapped behind his eyes while the rest of him turned into dead equipment. Her own pulse hammered so hard she could hear it. He tipped over at last, with the armor thudding flat against the floor, helmet canted, eyes open and fixed on the underside of the counter. The room smelled like plaster dust, antiseptic, hot metal, and the sour chemical tang from the shattered drug bottles. Natalie pressed one palm to her side and felt heat spreading under the scrubs. Every breath came in broken pieces now. She made herself move before the pain could vote. First, the gun. She got to the MP7 on one knee, coughing against the stab in her ribs, and wrapped her hand around the grip. The weapon woke with a tiny red blink near the trigger housing, then flashed denial at her like a machine sneer. Biometric lock. Of course. She tried once more because sometimes pain made people stupid. Same answer. Red. Useless. Cute, she whispered through clenched teeth, and nearly blacked out laughing at it. She let the gun fall, then stripped what mattered instead. Radio from the vest. Fixed blade knife in a Kydex sheath. Small, tactical light. Extra magazine she couldn't use but took anyway out of spite. Blood from her side dotted the white tile in uneven little commas. The radio cracked in her hand, a breathy voice under static, calm as a checkout clerk. Ghost 2 report. Extraction 15%. Seal 4B. Burn the LAN if you meet resistance. Natalie closed her eyes for one beat, building the shape of it. Not a kill team. A data grab with a body count allowance. She looked toward the vented wall that separated the medroom from the ward, and thought of Tex in bed 2, pinned in place but mean enough to look where she told him. Another pulse of pain folded through her ribs. She stayed on her feet anyway. Then she limped for the door, with the dead man's radio hissing cold directions into her palm. The radio whispered again before Natalie reached Tex's room. Extraction 15%. Same flat voice. Same lack of hurry. That chilled her worse than shouting would have. 15 meant the target was digital, somewhere buried in the hospital's nervous system, and the men sealing 4B were only there to keep the meat from getting ideas. She moved bent over, one forearm locked across her bad side, each step short and mean. Her cracked rib turned every breath into a choice. In through the nose, shallow. Out slow. Don't cough, don't stumble. The red emergency strips painted the ward in bands of arterial light, enough to show her blood smearing along the wall where her fingertips brushed for balance. She slipped into Tex Graves's room and kicked the door almost closed behind her. Tex was half upright already, sweat silvering his forehead, one hand clamped so hard around the titanium bar in his ruined thigh that the tendons stood out like cable. His eyes dropped to the blood on her scrubs, then to the knife in her hand, then to her face. He started to speak. Natalie raised 2 fingers and pressed them to her own lips. Not hard, just enough. His mouth shut. The hospital laptop sat under his bed, where staff kept it for charting and boredom. Natalie crouched for it and nearly saw stars when her ribs shifted. She stayed there a second, forehead against the mattress frame, until the spike of pain stopped trying to blind her. Then she dragged the machine out, flipped it open, and felt relief when the battery indicator came alive. Internal power. Good. Her phone was dead to the world, but wall jacks still mattered. She yanked the hardline from the bedside monitor hub and snapped it into the laptop port. Physical LAN. Old-fashioned, beautiful. The radio on the tray table hissed with another coded update, numbers and clipped confirmations. Men talking around the edges of a theft too big to name. Natalie brought up a blank terminal instead of the charting system. Black screen. White cursor. Her fingers hovered for half a breath, then stopped. Just one hitch. One half breath. She looked at the blinking cursor and knew exactly what pressing enter meant. Years of invisibility. Years of being just another burned-out night nurse. Gone the second this left the machine. Then she moved with the speed of something she had never really forgotten. 9 digits first, then the buried command string, exec, broken arrow, auth, trident. She hit enter. No anthem, no fireworks, just a line of text vanishing into the internal fibre like a stone dropped down a well. Tex watched her hands, and whatever joke had been forming in him died there without being born. Only after the signal was gone did she open what he was allowed to see. The security panel came up under an admin bypass she knew she should not still remember. Camera windows flowered across the screen hallway intersections. Nurse's station, the service elevator mouth, half the floor cut into neat little boxes. Red light, glare. Shadows moving like oil. Tex swallowed so hard she heard it. His whole body had gone still, except for the hand crushing the titanium frame through his leg. Natalie could feel him recalculating her from scratch. Good. Less talking that way. She slid the laptop onto his tray table and angled the screen toward him while she stood just off to one side, listening to the ward and the radio and the awful labouring hitch in her own breath. "You're my eyes," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she wanted, but flat enough to do the job. "Call positions by the 12-hour clock. Use the helmet numbers." Don't waste breath. Tex looked from the cameras to her, to the blood running down her side, back to the cameras. Jesus, he said, barely louder than the HVAC. Natalie shook her head once. No, not that. He leaned in, one hand braced on the tray, the other still white around the titanium bar, and started reading the floor the way he'd probably read terrain once through blown optics and bad weather. His voice came through his teeth, dry and clipped. 1 at your 11. Helmet 2. Slow sweep near the medroom. Natalie moved to the wall beside the door, knife low, radio turned down until it was more vibration than sound. Tex clicked to another feed with clumsy fingers, not hacking, just looking. Hold. Another one crossing the nurse's station. Helmet 4. He's covering long. Sweat rolled off his temple and darkened the pillowcase. The room smelled like antiseptic, warm electronics, and the copper tang leaking out of Natalie's uniform. Somewhere outside, a patient cried once and got shushed into silence. On the screen, black armoured figures cut across the ward in careful angles, sealing, searching, compressing. Tex licked dry lips and clicked again. A blind corner came up on camera, then movement sliding through it. His breath caught. 2 tangos, blind alley C-sector. They're heading straight for your hole. Natalie touched the latch with bloody fingertips, counted the beats between footsteps, and let the mask of the exhausted night nurse fall off her face for good. Natalie eased the latch and slipped into the narrow service hall with her knife down by her thigh. The place smelled like bleach, hot dust, and old wiring. A yellow jet blast sign glowed dully on the wall ahead, half joke, half landmark, the same ugly square of metal she had used all year to tell float nurses where the dead stock was kept. Now it was a ranging point, 10 feet to the busted fluorescent, 7 more to the blind bend. Her rib hurt so bad it had stopped being pain and turned into weather, a whole low-pressure system trapped under her skin. She could hear the 2 operators before she saw them. Boots. Fabric brushing ceramic plate. A faint plastic tap from one man's GPNVG housing kissing a doorframe. Natalie kept breathing through her nose, shallow and mean, 1 breath at a time. "Distance?" she whispered. Tex answered right away, dry and tight. 5 seconds. Helmet 2 in front. Helmet 4 on his shoulder. They're stacked tight. She palmed a squat bottle of medical alcohol from a cart parked in the shadow and tested the broken light overhead with a quick glance. 1 cracked tube. 1 live ballast hissing weakly. Good enough. She waited until the first black shape cut into the mouth of the alley. Then she threw. The bottle hit the fluorescent with a hard glass pop, burst open, and drenched the fixture just as the ballast coughed a blue-white spark. Fire bloomed all at once. Not big. Worse than big. A savage white slap of light that filled the hallway and came back in the mirrored curves of 4-lens night vision. Natalie heard the men make the same sound half a beat apart, a raw, involuntary grunt as their goggles went to blooming white and fed them a wall of pain. Helmet 2 tore at his face rig. Helmet 4 jerked his muzzle high and fired blind, rounds chewing plaster above her head. She was already moving. No leap, no hero stuff. She dropped low and slid on 1 knee through the wash of burning alcohol, 1 hand skidding on tile slick with spilled disinfectant. The knife went where armor couldn't. Straight into the groin crease under the plate line, then across. Deep. 4 inches maybe. Enough. The edge met artery and the body answered immediately. Hot blood sluiced over her wrist, slick and pumping, iron sharp in the air. Helmet 2 folded with both hands flying down too late, his weapon clattering off the wall as the black pool under him spread fast and glossy. Shock had already begun to empty him out. Helmet 4 got 1 eye free of the ruined GPNVG and found her through pain and afterimage. The MP7 swung toward motion because training will always outrun thought for a second or 2. Natalie saw the muzzle and tried to turn smaller. Too slow. The round caught her left upper arm and ripped through the meat of the biceps in a tearing sideways bite that felt, at first, like somebody had shoved white-hot wire straight through the muscle. Then came the wet warmth. Then the weakness. Her hand opened on reflex, and the knife nearly went. She kept it by 2 fingers, and pure spite. The operator drove forward, half blind, trying to body her into the wall and hose the hallway down at contact distance. She crashed into him instead, chest to armoured back, cracked rib scraping hard across his plate carrier so sharply her knees almost buckled. Black spots sprayed across her vision. No room for them. She slung her good arm around his neck, fed the bleeding left forearm under his chin, and locked a blood choke the old ugly way, biceps on one carotid, forearm on the other, head tight, hips glued to him. He staggered, slammed her against the cinder block, clawed at her wrists. She held on. Tex was counting in her ear. He did it without drama, without asking if she was still there. 1, 2, 3. Helmet 4 staggered backward, boots slipping in his partner's blood. His gun rattled once into the floor and went off harmlessly, rounds punching sparks from tile. Natalie tightened the choke and felt her own lungs tearing at the inside of her chest. 4. The man's hands lost some of their intelligence. Fingers that had been prying turned stupid and broad and weak. 5. Her cracked rib ground under the press of his armour, and a tiny animal noise leaked out of her before she could kill it. 6. The operator went heavy all at once. Not dead yet, just gone. She stayed on him another beat anyway, because half measures got people zipped into bags. When she let go, he collapsed forward into the widening black lake around the first man. Natalie stumbled back and hit the wall. Blood ran off her arm in long, warm ribbons, down her wrist into her palm. Her hand no longer wanted to close all the way. The hallway looked dipped in red and white and arterial black. For one beat, there was nothing in her ear but her own ragged breathing, and the radio's thin static. Then the stolen set crackled. A new voice came through at last, low, breathy, almost bored, with that bad stop-start respiration under the words like a damaged pump, trying to find rhythm. Ghost actual to all stations. Push the hack. Burn the LAN. Natalie pressed her ruined arm against her body, listened to Tex swear once under his breath, and understood the floor had just gotten smaller. Tex disappeared in a burst of static. 1 second she had his dry breathing and the scrape of his thumb on the laptop keys as he switched cameras. The next, the line went flat and ugly in her ear, then died altogether. Natalie held still in the bloody hallway, listening to the silence that followed. Not quiet. Worse than quiet. The kind of dead air that made her notice every other sound. The drip off her elbow, the soft hiss of something burning out in the ceiling, the far-off clatter of metal inside the ward. No overwatch. No clock call. No warning if somebody rounded the far corner. Her left arm was leaking hard now, each pulse pushing fresh heat down to her elbow. Somewhere deeper in the ward, metal clanged against metal. Not gunfire this time, but somebody working a cabinet, a switch box, a patch panel. Burn the LAN. They were doing exactly what they said they would. Natalie peeled herself off the wall and moved, one palm dragging along the cinder block to keep the floor from tilting out from under her. The nearest admin station sat past the charge nurse office, behind a glass panel painted with cheap navy stencils and old policy numbers nobody ever read. She knew the room by smell before she saw it. Burnt coffee, printer toner, stale hand lotion, the dry heat of overworked electronics. Her rib made every step a personal insult. The biceps wound had gone from fire to numbness at the edges, which was worse. Numb meant blood loss was starting to buy real estate in her head. She shoved the office door with her shoulder and nearly went down when it stuck on a stack of binders. Inside, the red emergency light fought with the glow of 3 live terminals, painting everything in alternating bands of bruise and bone. Natalie locked the door, though the latch felt childish against men like the ones outside. Then she slid into the chair at the main desk and woke the central admin screen with bloody fingertips. Login prompt. Good. The machine still believed in hierarchy. She gave it hers. Username first. Password next. Then the elevated credential she had not touched in months, because touching it meant admitting the hospital had never really hired just a nurse. The cursor blinked. Accepted. Another window. Another gate. Behind her eyes she could feel the architecture of the place, the way some people felt weather fronts, records, server, biometric archive, pharmacy mirror, legal hold vault, all the little locked boxes hospitals used to pretend information could be made safe by policy alone. The stolen radio whispered clipped fragments from the hall. Movement. Sector calls. Somebody breathing through damage. Natalie opened a terminal pane and found the active extraction process already running against the data core, a clean bar moving across black space with machine confidence. 87. 88. She dropped into the hospital's HIPAA lockdown layer, the federal privacy fail-safe they had bolted over the system years ago, and prayed nobody would ever need under real pressure. Then she turned the key they had never meant anyone to use under fire. The effect was immediate and almost petty. Every external port slammed shut in software, hard and final, as if the building had pursed its lips. A blue shield icon flashed once, then the extraction bar on the adjacent pane stuttered and froze at 89%. Not rolled back, not defeated, just jammed in place, a thief halfway through a window with the frame suddenly shrinking around his ribs. The speakers under the monitor started spitting warning tones. Sharp little beeps at first, then faster, then angry. Natalie watched the hostile process shove at the closed gate with brute force recursion, ugly and relentless. The hospital answered in its own language. Firewall logs cascaded. Access collisions stacked on top of access collisions. Memory fault notices flowered red down the side of the screen. She did not have time to admire any of it. Her vision tunneled once and came back. She braced her forearms on the desk to keep herself upright and tasted copper where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. This was the whole trick, really. Not strength. Not courage. Just knowing which piece of a big, dumb system would panic first when somebody asked it to betray itself. Another alarm kicked in, lower now, heavier, like the building had found a bell deep in its own chest and started hammering on it. Then the failsafe woke up. A red banner crashed across the top monitor, so bright it painted her face the color of fresh meat. Error strings rolled beneath it, then condensed into the only words that mattered. Hard power cycle initiated. Server reboot in 3 minutes. All magnetic doors unlocked. Natalie stared at it for one beat and felt the logic finish assembling. The HIPAA lockdown had frozen the pull at 89. The hostile brute force had kept ramming. The mainframe had decided the safest thing left was to dump RAM, drop live state, and come back from zero. 3 minutes of blindness for everyone. 3 minutes with the basement doors standing open, because magnetic locks always failed one direction or the other when power handling changed. She heard something crash outside the office and knew the men hunting the data would understand the same thing within seconds. No techs, no cameras, no more ward-level game. From here on out it was a race to the server room and whatever waited around it. Natalie pushed herself up from the chair using her good arm, swayed, caught the desk, and looked once more at the red countdown, eating its way downward. Then she took the knife, the radio, what was left of her breath, and started limping for the stairwell to the basement. The stairwell pitched under Natalie halfway to the basement. 1 second she was counting steps off the wall, and the next, the concrete came up hard and cold against her shoulder. Her left arm had gone slick to the wrist, blood running down into her palm and dripping off 2 fingers in patient little taps that sounded louder than they should have. Hypovolemic drift. Tunnel vision. That floating, dishonest calm the body threw over the mind right before it shut the lights off. She sat hard on the landing and pressed her spine to the cinder block, sucking air through her nose in small, broken pulls because the cracked rib on her left side punished anything deeper. The basement alarm still moaned through the stairwell, low and mechanical, and somewhere below it, all the reboot clock kept eating itself alive. 3 minutes never sounded so short until you tried to buy them in blood. Natalie looked at the mess of her upper arm. The 4.6 round had torn a gutter through the biceps instead of taking the limb off. Better than bone, worse than clean. Torn muscle fibers split apart like raw butcher's meat. Every heartbeat pushed another dark sheet down her forearm. She could feel the strength leaving with it. Her hand shook once. She made a fist until it stopped. The supply pouch from the dead man rode heavy against her hip. She dumped it into her lap with clumsy fingers and found the stapler by touch, cold steel jaws and cheap plastic grip, then a syringe pack, then the amp of epinephrine. No morphine. Not if she wanted the next 3 minutes to happen in the same universe. Natalie hooked 2 fingers into the torn sleeve of her scrub top and ripped it away from the wound. Fabric stuck and came free wet. The sight of it almost made her black out harder than the pain. Almost. She jammed the corner of her collar between her teeth, not for drama, just to keep the noise in, and planted the stapler over the split flesh. She brought the edges together with her right hand, feeling hot blood slide across her knuckles, then squeezed. Cack. The first staple punched into living muscle with a dry metallic bite that travelled straight through her teeth and into the base of her skull. White flooded her vision. She held on, breathed once, repositioned. Cack. The second one went in uglier, half through skin, half through raw meat, and she nearly vomited from the shock of it. Tears came without permission. She ignored them. Cack. Third staple. The sound seemed to hang in the stairwell after the pain landed, flat and industrial, like a metronome built out of suffering. Cack. 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 A tool meant for neat operating rooms, not this concrete hole that smelled like dust, blood, and old mopping chemicals. For a few seconds she couldn't move. Her body had narrowed to rib, arm, heartbeat. The cold wall at her back felt good enough to sleep on. Dangerous thought. She spat the collar from her mouth and fumbled open the epinephrine amp with fingers that no longer felt like they belonged to her. 1 milligram. Too much to feel normal. Exactly enough to stay vertical a little longer. Natalie drew it up, slid the needle through the fabric of her scrub pants, and buried it deep into the side of her thigh. The plunger went down under a shaking thumb. Nothing happened. Then all of it did. Her pulse slammed upward so hard it seemed to kick behind her eyes. The stairwell sharpened. Every edge came back mean and bright. Pain didn't leave. It just got shoved into a corner with a boot on its throat. Her cracked rib was still there, grinding with every breath. Her arm still leaked under the crude U-shaped teeth of the staples, but the fog pulled back. Natalie pushed herself upright with her good hand and stood swaying on legs that now wanted to run farther than the body attached to them reasonably could. A laugh almost escaped her at that. The human machine. Flood it with the right chemical, and it would betray itself in whichever direction you asked. The basement door stood 10 yards below, cracked open just enough to leak pale server room light into the stairwell. Natalie took 1 step down, then another. At the threshold, she saw the shadow first. Broad shoulders, helmet. Suppressor held steady in a 2-handed grip that did not tremble even once. Ghost Actual had chosen the foot of the stairs like a man choosing a firing point on a range. He stood half in the open doorway, half in the wash of cold fluorescent spill, armor black, lenses dead and unreadable. The long barrel pointed exactly where her chest would be when she committed to the last 3 steps. Through the hush she heard it the odd rise and fall in his breathing, too deep, then too shallow by turns, that bad staggered rhythm she had caught over the radio earlier. Shane Stokes, a heart or lung problem tucked inside all that armor. Useful later, maybe. Not now. Right now the only true thing in the world was the gun at the bottom of the stairs, and the fact that he had been waiting while she stapled herself together like a butchered package. Natalie went still. 1 hand braced on the railing, blood drying tacky down her wrist. Ghost Actual did not speak. He just watched her over the muzzle, patient as a trap already sprung. Ghost Actual opened fire the instant the crash cart broke cover. Natalie had shoved it hard from the stairwell threshold and flattened herself behind the concrete return wall before it rolled 3 feet. The MP7 chewed through plastic drawers, IV tubing, sealed packs of gauze, all of it exploding into white scraps and rattling metal. Syringes snapped. A suction canister burst and sprayed clear fluid across the tile. The sound in the server room was less bang than vicious mechanical tearing, the suppressor taking the edge off the muzzle and leaving the ugly inner noises bolt clack, brass ping, rounds smacking steel. Natalie kept low and counted them by feel more than thought. Short, controlled burst. Pause. Another. Target fixation. He was pouring his attention into the moving decoy instead of the corners that could kill him. Good. The server rooms smelled like hot circuitry, coolant water, and the first acrid thread of gun smoke. Racks of equipment blinked through the dim, half the drive arrays still alive on backup power, the reboot cycle somewhere in their guts. Natalie crawled the edge of the wall with the defibrillator handle in her good hand and one lead clamped between bleeding fingers. The metal paddle bit into her palm so hard it opened the skin there. She barely noticed. She had one chance to make the room itself violent enough to matter. A coolant line or condensate pipe had taken a stray round earlier. Water spread from beneath the main rack in a thin silver fan, running into the grout lines and pooling beside the floor drain. Natalie thumbed the defibrillator dial up until it hit 360. The machine began its shrill, rising whine. Obscene in the cramped room, a hospital sound in the wrong war. Charge building. Ghost Actual heard it and shifted his fire toward the noise. Rounds punched sparks off the rack, where her head had been a second earlier. Natalie ripped the insulation back from the lead with her teeth, copper flashing bare in the low light, and flung both exposed ends into the water just as the charge tone peaked. Then she hit the shock buttons with both bloody thumbs. The arc flash came out of the floor like God clearing his throat. White blue light filled the room in one savage convulsion, hotter to the eye than flame, jumping through the puddle and into the rack feet. The open panel, the cheap extraction hardware wired into the array. Drives popped. A power supply blew with a fist-sized burst of sparks. The lenses on Ghost Actual's NVG rig went milk white, then burst in tiny snapping pops, smoke curling off the frame. Ozone slapped the back of Natalie's throat so hard she coughed blood into her teeth. The metal rim of the paddle had already sliced her palm. Now it sat warm and slick in her hand. He was blind, not dead. Important difference. Ghost Actual ripped at the ruined goggles and came through the smoke fast, guided by memory and rage and pure training. Natalie met him with the empty defibrillator casing and swung low, not at his chest plate, at the knee. The hit jarred her whole skeleton and barely changed his line. He smashed the MP7 stock sideways into her right shoulder. Something tore loose with a sick, wet slip. Her arm dropped numb and useless at once, the old joint finally giving up and leaving a molten wire of pain from neck to wrist. She hit the floor on one knee. He came over her like a collapsing wall. No words, just that terrible broken breathing, too deep and too shallow by turns, snagging in his throat as he reached for the pistol on his thigh reg. Natalie kicked the inside of his lead leg with both feet and took the joint sideways. He stumbled. She climbed him the ugly way, from underneath, because there was no other way left. Her right arm was dead weight, so she used what still worked. One leg hooked high across his throat, the other locked behind her knee. Her left arm snaked under his chin and clamped the far carotid while her legs cinched down around his neck and shoulder in a desperate blood choke held together by pain and leverage. Blood from her torn biceps slicked his collar and mask. He hammered an elbow into her cracked ribs. Light burst behind her eyes. She held on. Her right arm flopped useless against the floor. Fine. Legs and left arm were enough if the angle stayed true. She clamped harder and felt the carotids flatten beneath the pressure. Ghost Actual fought for maybe 6 seconds, maybe a century. Time had gone strange again. His gloved hands tore at her forearm, then lost strength by degrees, not all at once. The Chain-Stokes rhythm in him broke apart under the choke. One ragged inhale, no clean exhale. Another little desperate pull that never finished. His boots scraped water across the tile. Natalie locked her ankles and kept squeezing until his body turned from violent to heavy, from heavy to deadweight, then heavier still. When she let go, He slumped sideways into the puddled light, half his ruined goggle rig submerged, the rise and fall under his armor finally gone. The room ticked and hissed around them. Burn drive smoked inside the rack. The defibrillator leads lay blackened in the water. Somewhere far overhead, faint at first and then clearer, sirens began to soar through the night from the street outside. Natalie rolled off him and sat there because standing was no longer a thing her body seemed willing to negotiate. Her right shoulder hung out of place. Her stapled arm throbbed. Her rib felt like shattered glass wrapped in meat. Ozone and scorched plastic made the air taste metallic and dry. She pressed her forehead to the cool side of the server rack and listened to the silence where Ghost Actual's breathing had been. Then the silence broke under the approaching wail of police, and the last of the adrenaline started to leave her alone with the damage. Red laser dots swept across the server room before the door even finished coming apart. Then the breach charge hit, a hard, flat concussion that kicked metal inward and turned the air into dust, smoke, and screaming. The silence from a second ago vanished so completely it felt like a slap. "Hands! Show me your hands!" The command came in 3 voices at once, stacked and ragged and trained to be obeyed before a brain could vote. Natalie lifted her head off the rack by degrees. Blue-red police light pulsed through the ruined doorway behind the black shapes flooding in. SWAT helmets, FBI windbreakers, rifle lights so bright they flattened the whole room into white shards and blood. Ghost Actual lay half in the cooling puddle beside her, with his ruined lenses blown white and black. The smoked server rack still hissed. Burned plastic and ozone sat thick on the back of her tongue. She knew what they saw. 4 dead military-trained operators in a butchered basement. One woman in shredded scrubs sitting in the middle of it, slick black with drying blood. One shoulder hanging wrong, one arm stapled shut by a lunatic. The nearest muzzle stopped inches from her face. "Hands, now!" somebody screamed again. Natalie's body wanted to fold up and protect the broken parts. Protocol wanted something else. She went with protocol. She raised both hands slowly where they could see them. Blood trailed off her fingers in lazy threads. The lights on the rifles painted her palms a hard surgical white under the red. "On your face!" a man barked. She did not waste breath explaining the dead commander, the hacked server, the doors, the clock, any of it. None of that existed in the first 10 seconds of an armed entry. Only angles, threat profiles, compliance. Natalie let her good knee slide, then the other. Every movement cost something. Her dislocated shoulder sent a deep electric pulse down her side. Her cracked rib bit hard enough to make the room strobe. She put one bloody hand on the tile, then the other, and lowered herself flat beside the server rack until her cheek touched the wet floor. Cold. Sticky. Her own blood and somebody else's coolant mixing under her skin. Boots thundered around her. Nylon squeaked. Someone kicked the dead MP7 away. Another voice, older and angrier, cut through the pile. "Clear that body. Watch her hands. Watch her fucking hands." Agent Miller, though she did not know his name yet. She heard him the way you heard a man trying to sound bigger than the thing in front of him. Hands grabbed her ankles, spread them. A knee drove into her back, not carefully, right over the busted rib, and white pain blew her vision open from the inside. She made no sound beyond the air the pressure knocked out of her. That seemed to bother them more than crying would have. "Jesus Christ," somebody muttered near her shoulder. Then the cuffs came out. Not steel. Plastic. Tactical zip ties thick as radiator hose and meaner than handcuffs because they had no give in them at all. Her wrists were dragged behind her. The stapled arm resisted halfway through the movement, and then came anyway, sending a hot, ripping sensation through the half-closed wound and up into the raw tissue above it. Miller crouched into her field of hearing and said, close and harsh, "You move wrong. You die wrong. Understand me?" Natalie stared at a blackened patch of tile and gave him nothing. The tie went around both wrists. Then came the tightening. A high, ugly zip, as the plastic ratchet bit and kept biting until it found bone under torn skin. Her fingers curled on reflex. The cut edges of the tie chewed into wrists. already slick with blood. She had taken worse pain in cleaner places, but this was different. This one arrived after the fight was over, after the adrenaline burned down, after the body had started trying to count its receipts. That made it intimate. Real. Somebody patted her down fast and rough, found the knife, the dead radio, the empty injector, and threw each one away with the disgust reserved for evidence and filth. The room began to tilt before they hauled her upright. Natalie knew the signs. Sound getting long and stretchy. Vision going dark at the edges. Pulse no longer in one place but everywhere at once. 2 operators dragged her to her knees anyway, one on each arm, and the bad shoulder nearly blacked her out on the spot. Across the smoke and strobing lights, she saw a camera phone lifted, then lowered when Miller snarled at someone to kill it. Good. Not for her. For the chain of custody. He wanted this room owned, tagged, bagged, and attached to her name before anybody federal took it away. Get medical down here after transport, he snapped. She goes in alive. Alive? Suspect first, patient second. Natalie might have smiled if she had enough face left for it. The zip ties dug deeper when they yanked her to her feet. A dark sheet rolled up through her chest. Somewhere beyond the breach, sirens kept feeding the night. Somebody shouted, "Scene secure." Somebody else called for a litter. Natalie took one breath, then another that did not quite finish, and let her knees buckle. The last thing she heard before the concrete rushed up was the plastic cuffs creaking against her wrists and a stranger saying, almost surprised, "She's gone out." Agent Miller hit the case file against the steel table hard enough to make Natalie flinch even through the painkillers. Photos skidded out under the fluorescent light-burned racks, black pools on white tile, the dead commander in his split goggles, her own bloody handprints on hospital equipment. The room smelled like cheap coffee, iodine, and government HVAC, that dry, over-filtered cold that made even breathing feel processed. Somebody had put her shoulder back in. Somebody had wrapped the stapled arm in fresh gauze and taped her ribs so tight every breath came shallow and borrowed. She sat with one wrist cuffed to a ring on the table, hospital scrub top replaced by grey sweats that still had the fold marks in them. 5 in the morning, maybe a little after. No windows. One metal door. One camera blister in the corner. Miller stayed standing because sitting would have made this a conversation, and he wanted an execution with paperwork. He jabbed a finger at the photos and then at her face. You killed 4 military-trained operators with a scalpel and staples. Your fingerprints pinged a redacted DOD database. What the hell are you, O'Connell? His voice bounced off the walls and came back sounding smaller. Natalie looked at the pictures, then at the blood crusted in the seams of her own knuckles, and said nothing. Silence was still the only honest thing she had left. That angered him the way silence always angers men who mistake noise for leverage. He slapped another packet down, this one thicker. Printouts, evidence tags, preliminary sheets. You don't get to hide behind shock. Not with this. Another smack of paper. Succinylcholine overdose. Femoral exsanguination. Electrocution. You butchered a Tier 1 unit with hospital scraps. He leaned in, palms flat, the table ringing under his weight. So tell me, O'Connell, what exactly are we holding in this room? Natalie kept her eyes on the edge of the table and counted his breathing instead. Fast. High in the chest. Angry. Territorial. Tired. He wanted murder because murder was a lane with forms and boxes and a neat straight road. He did not want intelligence flags, buried access codes, or a hospital nurse whose fingerprints had tripped a compartmented defense system. Talk to me, and I might keep you out of a federal hole, he said. Keep staring, and I bury you in one. The cuff around her wrist tugged when she shifted. Metal this time, better than plastic. Worse in a different way. Her body hurt everywhere at once, a flattened landscape of damage. Somewhere outside the room, shoes crossed tile, paused, moved on. Miller followed the sound with one twitch of the eyes, then came back harder. Who sent you? JSOC? DIA? Some private wet workshop running under hospital cover? Still nothing. Natalie let him spend himself. When the door opened, it did not slam. That was the first sign this was not his interruption. A man in a cheap grey suit stepped in, like he had been expected by the building if not by the people in it. No uniform, no shine. His tie was off-centre, his shirt collar wilted, and his badge hung backward on purpose, blank white facing out. He carried a manila folder under one arm and a paper cup of coffee in the other. Miller straightened so fast the chair behind him scraped, though he had never used it. "This interview is active," he snapped. The man in grey set the coffee down, took a single sheet from the folder, and flipped it onto the table with 2 fingers. Not dramatic, not loud. Final, anyway. The paper slid across the steel and stopped against Miller's knuckles. Department of Justice seal. Court language. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Miller read 3 lines and all the blood left his face at once, as if somebody had uncapped a drain in him. "No," he said. Then lower. Furious because lower was all he had left. "You've got to be kidding me." The grey suit man finally looked at Natalie. No warmth in it. No triumph either. Just inventory. Then he looked back at Miller. "This matter no longer exists in your lane. Uncuff her." For a second, Miller stood there with murder in his posture and surrender in his hands. Then the law won, because it always did when it came stamped by bigger monsters. He stepped around behind Natalie, unlocked the cuff with a violence aimed mostly at the table, and let the chain slap free. "This is bullshit," he said. 4 bodies. A compromised military hospital. And you people still get to come in after the smoke clears and salt the file." The grey suit man waited him out. Natalie rolled her wrist once when it was free, feeling the raw groove the metal had left. Miller collected exactly none of his dignity, shoved the photos into a crooked stack, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he looked back at Natalie like he wanted to memorize her for a later war. Then he was gone. The door shut heavy. The man in grey picked up his coffee, took one small indifferent sip, and set a folded set of clean clothes on the table beside her. "Your broken arrow code almost gave the Pentagon a heart attack," he said. His voice was flat enough to sandwood. "Your civilian cover is officially burned. You don't get to save lives in the light anymore." Natalie looked at him for the first time all the way. Exhaustion had scraped her hollow. "So this is the thank you card." The man did not blink. "Truck's out back," he said. "We're going back to the dark,